Hello, and welcome to the New Mexico Museum of Art's Smarter Smartphone Photography Series. I'm Chris Nail, your museum educator. Last time we took a look at including information or content in your photographs to help a viewer understand what's going on. Now let's take a look at how to arrange that content. When we talk about composition or framing, sometimes we hear about the rules of composition, which can sound a little intimidating or restrictive. Plus, there are a lot of these rules, and it can seem a little overwhelming. So, for our purposes, let's not think of them as rules, but as good ideas or guidelines. And as all good rules in art, there are times when they should definitely be broken. Let's keep things simple and focus on one rule of composition, the rule of thirds. It usually works well and it's easy to understand, and your camera app may even have the option to overlay the grid it's based on over the image you're making, which can be a big help. Here is our bad picture of a horse that we used as an example of what not to do when we talked about context. This image does not use the rule of thirds. Our main subject is at the center of the image, and the composition doesn't give us much of a reason to look at anything else. Flip through a family photo album on the bookshelf or online, and you may find some portraits that have faces framed just like this. The rule of thirds places an imaginary grid over your image. The idea is to avoid placing your subject inside of the middle box. Instead, we want to put the subject and other important elements along the grid lines and at their intersections. About the only thing that went right with this image is that the horizon line falls along one of these grid lines. This image makes much better use of the rule of thirds. The tree, its branches, the rocks in the background, and where the rocks meet the ground all work together to help move the viewer around the image and create a relationship between these elements. Here's an approximate overlay of the grid, and as you can see, things don't perfectly line up, and that's okay. Again, think of this as a guideline, not a rule. Aligning your subject matter near the grid lines but not perfectly matching them will usually be just fine. Thinking this way can help your composition without making you forget about what you're actually photographing or taking the fun out of your image making. Here's another example of the elements of our image not quite falling on those grid lines, but being close enough to make things work. The face of the woman in the image is pretty close to an intersection of those lines. The rough line of rocks in the foreground comes close, as do parts of the horizon line. We have some other implied lines, an element we'll talk about in a later installment, that also roughly line up with the grid. Now that we have a real basic understanding of the rule of thirds, let's break it. Here, the subject, or at least the focal point, is placed at the center of the image, but it still works, unlike the horse. Often, when we break a rule of composition, we may simply be following a different rule. In this case, the image is very balanced, meaning that no one part of the image, aside from the central focus, has more visual weight or importance than any other. For this reason, the balance is achieved using radial symmetry. I guess this means we've looked at two rules of composition. Sorry about that. Hopefully, these guidelines are easy to remember, easy to use, and not at all intimidating. In our next installment, we'll talk about the importance of angles and your point of view for creating dynamic and interesting images. You can keep up with everything that's going on at the museum by following us on Facebook, Instagram, or by checking our website. Until then, go make some art.